So when you're talking about the Nile and we're talking about ancient Egypt, how far back do you think that goes?
Oh, I think the Nile goes back a very, very, very long way. The Nile River system 12,500 years ago looked much the same as it does today. Actually, Africa suffered much less from sea level rise than many other continents. The place that was most dramatically affected by sea level rise was around Indonesia and Malaysia. Geologists call it the Sunda Shelf. And again, it shows up on ancient maps as it looked during the Ice Age, not as it looks today. There was a continent-sized landmass that went underwater there. If your continental shelves are very shallow and very, very limited and very deep, then you don't lose a lot of land. But if they're slow and gradual, you lose a great deal of land. Africa didn't suffer so much. The Nile River system was pretty much 12,500 years ago the way that it is today. The big difference was that the Sahara Desert was green and fertile.
And this coincides with Dr. Robert Schoch's
absolutely
assertion that when you look at the Temple of the Sphinx, you're dealing with thousands of years of water erosion.
Yes.
And the last time there was water like that in the Nile Valley was when?
The last time you had the water erosion like that in the Nile Valley was precisely during the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a period of extremely heavy rains in Africa, and it's rainfall, it's erosion caused by heavy rains that is the enigma on the Great Sphinx. We're not saying that there was a flood came over the Great Sphinx. What Robert Schoch is saying, and what his evidence clearly demonstrates, is that we're looking at what's called precipitation-induced weathering that was caused by exposure to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Dr. Robert Schoch puts that 1,000 years precisely in the Younger Dryas period. That's the last time that rains of that magnitude fell on Egypt, and it's why we cannot sensibly accept the insistence of Egyptologists that the Sphinx is just 4,500 years old. By all means, yes, 2,500 BC, the ancient Egyptians were there, but I believe they found the Sphinx already created and already heavily eroded, and that they then recarved its head into the head of a pharaoh. And that head, as Robert Schoch and others have pointed out, is way too small in relation to the body. That makes sense if it was a heavily eroded lion head, which was then later cut down into the head of a pharaoh. The geology speaks to the original Sphinx being more than 12,000 years old. And that's the funny thing, because when Robert Schoch, and let's not forget John Anthony West, and I know you had him on his show before he passed. John Anthony West was the first person to suggest that there should be a huge question mark over the Sphinx, that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest it was much older than Egyptologists said, and maybe 12,000 years old. And at that time, the response of Egyptology was, rubbish. The Sphinx can't possibly be 12,000 years old because there's no other megalithic monument anywhere in the world that's anywhere like 12,000 years old. Well, that got blown out of the water completely, forever, by the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which isn't even that far from Egypt. Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years old, a giant megalithic site. My goodness, if you can make Göbekli Tepe, you can make the Sphinx. It adds hugely to the credibility of Robert Schoch's argument. And I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch, because there's a mainstream academic who's been willing to stick his neck out. Despite taking all sorts of slings and arrows from his colleagues, he sticks with the data. And what the data says, regardless of what Egyptologists say, is that the Sphinx is 12,000 plus years old.
And Jamie, can you pull up some of the images of that? Because it is really compelling. When you look at the water erosion evidence that is all around the Temple of the Sphinx, it's really fascinating stuff, even for someone who doesn't know much about erosion. But when you look at it through his descriptions and his understanding of the various levels of stone, how some of it is harder, and this is the reason why some of it is eroded less.
You see it most clearly in the trench surrounding the Sphinx. You see it there.
Right.
Those deep vertical fissures are classic precipitation-induced weathering, classic weathering produced by rainfall pouring over the edge of that. You don't see it so much on the body of the Sphinx for a very specific reason, that the body of the Sphinx has been repeatedly restored. Some of those blocks that we're looking at there were actually put in place during the Old Kingdom, when the Sphinx is supposed to have been made from new. What were they doing restoring the Sphinx 4,500 years ago if they'd just built it? You know, logic needs to be applied to this whole process, and we need to free ourselves from the dogma of the academic mainstream. And
so if this water erosion began thousands and thousands of years ago, thousands and thousands of years earlier than conventional Egyptologists date this era, how old do you think that actual civilization was? Like, how far back?
I think it could go back 20,000 years before that. I think it was around all that time. And again, this is a point that I think needs to be made. Archaeologists will tell you that the entire population of the Earth were hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age, say 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last Ice Age. Everybody was hunter-gatherers, according to archaeologists. But we today live in a world where an advanced civilization, our own, if we dare call ourselves advanced, and in some ways I think we're not advanced at all, coexists with hunter-gatherers. There are hunter-gatherers in the Amazon rainforest. Some of them don't even know we exist. They've been spotted from aerial surveys. Hunter-gatherers in the Namibian desert. The notion that different types of civilization can coexist on the same planet shouldn't be surprising to us, because we do it. And that's what I'm suggesting was the case back then. But a civilization very different from our own. They certainly had technology, enough technology to explore the Earth, enough technology to map the Earth, very advanced astronomy, knowledge of obscure astronomical phenomena such as the precession of the equinoxes, such as the obliquity of the ecliptic. I won't go into details, but it's present in ancient knowledge. There's an amazing book, which I may have mentioned to you before, Joe, a book called Hamlet's Mill. And it was written by two professors of the history of science, Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen, back in the 60s. And what that book is dynamite, because it shows, going back into the oldest myths and traditions of the world, highly advanced astronomical knowledge. Astronomical knowledge that should not have been possessed by hunter-gatherer civilizations, astronomical knowledge that could only have been accumulated through thousands of years of careful observation and recording of data. That astronomical knowledge is present in the most ancient myths of mankind. And in fact, it was that book, Hamlet's Mill, just as much as my first experience in front of the Great Pyramid, that led me to begin asking questions about the narrative of our past. And I think it's healthy that we should have an alternative narrative. And I can't understand why archaeology is so, I have to say, so afraid of alternative narratives.